Somewhere in rural Maryland, if you know where to look, you can still walk along a ditch. It's overgrown now, choked with weeds, its stone walls crumbling into moss. Deer drink from puddles where barges once floated. But 2 centuries ago, this quiet trench was one of the most important engineering projects in American history. It moved fortunes. It built cities. It connected a fractured young nation and turned it into an economic power. And then, almost as quickly as it rose, it was left to rot, swallowed by forests, forgotten by the highways and railroads that replaced it. This is the story of America's canals, the arteries that built a country, and the strange, quiet way the country abandoned them. Before there were railroads, before there were highways, there was a problem. In the early 1800s, the United States was enormous, and it was almost impossible to move anything across it. A farmer in Ohio might grow more wheat than his family could ever eat, but there was no way to get it to a city where people would pay for it. Roads were little more than mud tracks, rutted by wagon wheels and washed out by rain. A trip that takes 4 hours by car today could take 4 days by horse-drawn cart, if the roads were passable at all. Goods rotted before they reached markets. Settlers moving west found themselves cut off from the rest of the country, separated not by distance alone but by the sheer difficulty of crossing it. Something had to change, or the new republic risked splitting apart before it had even finished forming. The answer, strange as it sounds today, was water. Rivers could carry enormous loads with far less effort than roads ever could. A single horse walking along a riverbank towpath could pull a barge loaded with 100 tons of cargo, a feat that would have required dozens of horses and wagons on land. The problem was that America's rivers didn't go where people needed them to go. They didn't connect the coast to the interior. They didn't link the Great Lakes to the Atlantic. So if nature hadn't provided the rivers, Americans decided they would build their own. This idea sounds almost absurd in scale. Dig a river. Carve a channel hundreds of miles long, by hand, through forests, swamps, and solid rock, using nothing but shovels, black powder, and mule power. No steam-powered excavators. No dynamite, which hadn't been invented yet. Just men, tools, and an almost unreasonable amount of stubbornness. And yet, in the early 19th century, that is exactly what happened, again and again, across the eastern half of the continent. The most famous of these projects, the one that proved it could be done, was the Erie Canal. In 1817, New York Governor DeWitt Clinton pushed for a canal that would stretch 363 miles, from Albany on the Hudson River all the way to Buffalo on Lake Erie. Critics mocked it mercilessly. They called it Clinton's Folly and Clinton's Ditch. President Thomas Jefferson himself had reportedly called the idea little short of madness a decade earlier, when it was first proposed to him. No canal of that length existed anywhere in the world at the time. The idea of cutting through hundreds of miles of wilderness, over hills, across rivers, through solid limestone, with no formally trained American civil engineers to lead the effort, seemed less like ambition and more like fantasy. But New York moved forward anyway. Teams of laborers, many of them Irish immigrants fleeing famine and poverty back home, began digging by hand in 1817. They worked in brutal conditions. Malaria, which they called canal fever, ravaged work camps built in mosquito-infested swamps. Explosions from unstable blasting powder killed and maimed workers with grim regularity. Winters froze the ground solid, summers baked it hard as brick, and still the digging continued, mile after mile, year after year. Along the way, self-taught engineers invented tools and techniques as they went, because no textbook existed to guide them. They built a stump-pulling machine to clear forests faster. They perfected a type of waterproof cement, called hydraulic cement, using limestone found near Syracuse, because they couldn't rely on imported materials from Europe. In a sense, the Erie Canal didn't just move goods, it trained an entire generation of American engineers who would go on to build railroads, bridges, and other canals across the country. And then, on October 26, 1825, after 8 years of grueling labor, the Erie Canal opened. Governor Clinton rode a ceremonial barge from Buffalo all the way to New York City, and as he passed, cannons stationed every few miles fired in sequence, relaying the news down the length of the canal and beyond in a chain reaction that took barely 90 minutes to travel hundreds of miles, a 19th-century version of instant news. When Clinton reached New York Harbor, he poured a keg of Lake Erie water into the Atlantic Ocean in a ceremony they called the Wedding of the Waters, symbolically joining the Great Lakes to the sea. The economic effects were almost immediate and genuinely staggering. Before the canal, shipping a ton of goods from Buffalo to New York City cost around $100 and took roughly 3 weeks. After the canal opened, that same ton could be shipped for around $10, in about 8 days. Freight costs dropped by up to 95% along that route. Farmers in Ohio and Michigan could suddenly sell their crops profitably in eastern markets. Manufactured goods from the east could reach the growing frontier towns cheaply. New York City, which had been a significant but not dominant port compared to Boston or Philadelphia, exploded into the undisputed commercial capital of the country, a position it has never really relinquished. Towns that sat along the canal route, Rochester, Syracuse, Utica, transformed almost overnight from small settlements into booming cities. The canal alone is often credited with helping New York earn its nickname, the Empire State. Naturally, the rest of the country watched, and they wanted what New York had. What followed has often been called Canal Mania, and it swept across the eastern United States with the kind of frenzied enthusiasm usually reserved for gold rushes. States and private companies rushed to dig their own canals, hoping to replicate New York's success. Pennsylvania, terrified of losing trade to its northern rival, embarked on an incredibly ambitious and famously troubled project called the Main Line of Public Works, which tried to connect Philadelphia to Pittsburgh using a bizarre combination of canals, inclined planes, and even a section where entire canal boats were hoisted onto railroad cars and hauled over the Allegheny Mountains. It was a marvel of improvisation, but it never came close to matching the simplicity and profitability of the Erie. Ohio built 2 major canals of its own, the Ohio and Erie Canal and the Miami and Erie Canal, both intended to link Lake Erie to the Ohio River, opening the state's interior to trade in a way that transformed it from a frontier territory into an agricultural powerhouse. Indiana attempted something even more ambitious with the Wabash and Erie Canal, which, at nearly 460 miles when finished, briefly held the title of the longest canal ever built in North America. Illinois carved out the Illinois and Michigan Canal, finally connecting the Great Lakes watershed to the Mississippi River system, which meant that, in theory, a boat could travel from New York City all the way to New Orleans without ever touching open ocean. Farther south, engineers dug the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal to shorten shipping routes along the mid-Atlantic coast, and to the north of Washington, laborers began construction on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, intended to link the nation's capital to the Ohio River Valley. Here is where the story takes a darker, more human turn, because the human cost of these projects is often left out of the celebration. Canal construction in this era was some of the most dangerous manual labor in the country. The workforce was overwhelmingly made up of immigrants, Irish laborers especially, many of whom had fled famine, political unrest, and poverty, only to find themselves digging trenches through disease-ridden swamps for wages that barely covered food and shelter. Cholera outbreaks tore through work camps along canals like the Chesapeake and Ohio, killing workers by the dozens in a matter of days. Living conditions in the shanty towns that sprang up along construction routes were often filthy and overcrowded. Tensions between rival groups of Irish laborers, divided along old regional and religious lines from home, sometimes erupted into violence severe enough that state militias had to be called in to restore order. And when workers died, which happened with grim frequency, many were buried in unmarked graves near the very trenches they had been digging, their names lost to history, while the canals they built were celebrated as triumphs of American progress. It's a haunting contradiction that sits at the heart of the entire canal era. The infrastructure that connected and enriched a nation was built, quite literally, on the backs of some of its most vulnerable people. Despite the human cost, and despite the genuine engineering triumphs, not every canal succeeded the way the Erie did. And this is where the story becomes even more interesting, because for every canal that transformed a region, there was another that became a costly, embarrassing failure. The Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, for instance, never came close to fulfilling its original vision. It was supposed to reach the Ohio River, opening a water route from the nation's capital deep into the western frontier. But construction dragged on for over 20 years, plagued by disease, financial troubles, legal disputes over land and water rights, and brutal terrain through the Appalachian foothills. By the time the canal finally reached its terminus at Cumberland, Maryland, in 1850, it had gone barely halfway to its original goal, and worse, a railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, had already beaten it there years earlier, running parallel to the canal for much of its length and rendering it obsolete before it was even finished. Imagine spending over 2 decades and untold sums of money building something, only to watch a competitor's version of the same idea complete the job faster while you were still digging. And that, in many ways, foreshadows the entire downfall of the canal era. Because just as canal mania was reaching its peak, a new technology was quietly emerging that would make even the most successful canals obsolete within a single generation. The railroad. Canals had one enormous, unavoidable weakness. They froze. For several months of the year, in the northern states especially, ice sealed the water shut, halting all traffic completely. Canals were also limited by geography in ways railroads simply were not. A canal needed a consistent water supply, manageable terrain, and an enormous amount of engineering to cross hills or connect different water levels using locks, which were slow to pass through, sometimes taking boats hours to navigate a single flight of locks stacked up a hillside. Railroads, by contrast, could run through winter. They could climb grades that canals could never manage. They could be built faster and, crucially, they were considerably faster to travel on once complete. A canal boat pulled by a mule might travel at a leisurely 2 to 4 miles per hour. An early steam locomotive could move 10 times that speed, and improve rapidly from there. The first blow came remarkably early. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, chartered in 1827, just 2 years after the Erie Canal opened, began construction with the explicit goal of doing exactly what canals did, but faster and year-round. Within a few decades, railroads were crisscrossing the very same regions that canal companies had spent fortunes trying to connect. And unlike canals, which were essentially fixed and immovable once dug, railroad tracks could be extended, rerouted, and expanded far more easily to reach new towns, new industries, and new markets as the country grew. Then, in 1837, an economic catastrophe accelerated everything. The Panic of 1837 was one of the worst financial crises in American history up to that point, triggered by a combination of speculative lending, a collapse in cotton prices, and a tightening of credit that sent banks across the country into failure. States that had borrowed heavily to fund ambitious canal projects, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, Maryland among them, suddenly found themselves unable to repay their debts. Several states defaulted outright. Construction on unfinished canals halted, sometimes permanently, leaving half-dug channels and abandoned locks scattered across the landscape, monuments to ambitions that ran out of money before they ran out of ground to cover. Indiana's Wabash and Erie Canal, that once record-holding waterway, never fully recovered its financial footing, and lingered on in a state of slow decline for decades before finally being abandoned in pieces. Even the canals that had succeeded, the ones that turned a profit and transformed their regions, could not escape the railroad's advance forever. The Erie Canal itself, the crown jewel of the entire era, saw its freight traffic steadily eaten away decade after decade as parallel rail lines offered faster, all-season alternatives. New York tried to fight back. The state widened and deepened the canal multiple times, most significantly in a massive early 20th century project that transformed it into the New York State Barge Canal, incorporating rivers and lakes into a more efficient route. For a while, it worked, and the canal remained commercially relevant well into the 1900s. But even the mighty Erie could not hold back the tide of trucks and trains forever. By the mid-20th century, commercial traffic on most of America's canal system had dwindled to a trickle, and many of the smaller, less adaptable canals had already been abandoned entirely, left to the forest. This is the point where most history books stop talking about canals. The story, as usually told, ends with railroads winning and canals fading quietly into irrelevance. But that's not really where the story ends. Because what happened to all that infrastructure afterward is, in its own way, just as fascinating as the boom that built it. Picture hundreds and hundreds of miles of hand-dug channels, stone locks, aqueducts, and towpaths, simply left where they were. Nobody tore most of them out. It was too expensive, and there was no real reason to bother. So nature did what nature does. Water stopped flowing through sections that lost their source. Silt and sediment built up in the channels. Trees took root in towpaths that mules had walked for decades. Locks that once lifted boats dozens of feet up hillsides became mossy stone staircases leading nowhere, admired occasionally by hikers who had no idea what they were looking at. In some towns along old canal routes, you can still find street names, Canal Street, Lock Street, Towpath Road, that are the only remaining clue that water once ran where cars now drive. Some of these forgotten canals met stranger fates. Sections of the Illinois and Michigan Canal were eventually replaced by a more modern shipping channel, the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, an engineering project so audacious it actually reversed the flow of the Chicago River. Other canals were partially drained and paved directly over, becoming roads that still trace their original winding, water-following curves today, a strange fossil of 19th-century engineering hidden in plain sight beneath modern asphalt. Still others were swallowed by industrial development, their locks buried under factories and warehouses that themselves eventually became obsolete and abandoned, layering one era's ruins on top of another. But not all of it disappeared. And here is where the story takes one final, almost redemptive turn. Starting in the mid-20th century, and accelerating through the following decades, a slow wave of rediscovery began. People started to recognize that these crumbling ditches and stone locks weren't just industrial leftovers, they were history, preserved in a way few other artifacts of the era could be. In 1971, Congress established the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal as a National Historical Park, protecting nearly 185 miles of towpath and turning what had once been a costly, unfinished failure into one of the most popular hiking and biking trails on the East Coast. The Erie Canal, or at least significant portions of it, was preserved as the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor, allowing modern boaters to travel sections of the original route, passing through locks that have operated continuously, in some form, for nearly 2 centuries. Old towpaths that mules once walked, hauling barges loaded with grain and timber, have become recreational trails stretching hundreds of miles, used today by joggers, cyclists, and history enthusiasts who often have no idea that the flat, tree-lined path beneath their feet was once one of the most vital transportation corridors in the entire country. There is something quietly moving about that transformation. The canals were built with backbreaking labor, by immigrants who were often treated as disposable, to serve an economy that itself would discard the canals within a single generation once something faster came along. And yet, unlike so much industrial infrastructure that simply gets demolished and forgotten, many of these waterways found a strange second life. They stopped being about speed and commerce entirely, and became about something slower, walking, remembering, noticing. The very obsolescence that doomed them commercially is part of what allowed them to survive at all. A railroad line still in active use gets modernized, replaced, updated beyond recognition. A canal that fails commercially, and gets abandoned rather than upgraded, sometimes just sits there, frozen in time, waiting for someone to rediscover it a century and a half later. Walk along the towpath of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal today, and you'll pass mile markers, lock houses, and the occasional interpretive sign describing what this stretch of water once meant to the country. You might not think about the Irish laborer who died of cholera digging the very trench beside you, or the mule that walked this exact path 6 days a week for 20 years, or the farmer in Ohio who, thanks to a canal 3 states away, was finally able to sell his wheat crop for a fair price for the first time in his life. But it all happened here, in these quiet, overgrown corridors that most Americans drive past every day without a second glance. America's canals never lasted as long as their builders hoped. Most of them were commercially irrelevant within 50 years of being built, footnotes squeezed between the era of the horse and the era of the locomotive. But for those few astonishing decades in the early 19th century, these hand-dug waterways did something extraordinary. They turned a scattered collection of states and territories into a connected, functioning economic nation. They built New York City into a global metropolis. They opened the Midwest to the world. And when their moment passed, when the railroads and later the highways made them obsolete, most of them didn't vanish completely. They simply went quiet, sinking gently back into the landscape, waiting patiently to be walked again. If you found out tomorrow that a forgotten canal, lock, or towpath was buried somewhere near your own hometown, would you go looking for it, or do you think some pieces of history are better left resting quietly beneath the weeds?